Hey everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at a video by the Fat Electrician. He makes really cool, fun history videos, and I like his stuff for the most part, so go check him out if you haven't already. But the reason I'm making this video today is that I checked out a video he did a few months ago while researching one of my own videos, and well, let's just say there were a few inaccuracies. Today we're going to be looking at this video, Angry Old Veteran versus 700 Redcoats, Samuel Whittmore. So I'm mostly going to be focusing on the part of the video that focuses on the Battle of Lexington and Concord, since the whole video is sort of a biography of Samuel Whittmore. But first, let's talk a bit about Whittmore himself. I'm going to leave most of that for Nick's video, so go check him out. But the skinny version is that Whittmore was a Massachusetts veteran who served in various wars with the British, even to an old age. And in the Battle of Lexington and Concord in 1775, where the American Revolutionary War started, Whittmore, aged 78, single-handedly killed 3 redcoats before being horribly injured, only to survive 18 more years to the age of 96. He's a pretty cool, badass guy, and I'm not going to be focusing on his life too much for the video. Instead, I'm going to correct a few things that the Fat Electrician says about the lead up to and beginning of the American Revolutionary War. I've been researching this a lot recently, and I've been working on a video about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, so I have learned a lot about this time in history, and it's really interesting, and I want to try and share some of that with you here, while also correcting some things a channel I like got wrong. Just to be clear, none of this is a swipe at him or his channel. Everyone gets things wrong sometimes. I definitely have. So this is just for the love of the game and the views. So first, let's look at a couple small issues with the video just around town names. These are nitpicks, but just bear with me for a second, please. So town lines and names have changed since the 1700s, surprisingly, and the current town of Arlington, Massachusetts used to be called Menotomy. However, Nick says this.
Now at this point, Sam is serving on a committee representing his hometown of Cambridge, which would later become known as Arlington.
Cambridge, for those who don't know, is still a city in Massachusetts. It's right next to Boston, and it's home to both Harvard and MIT. Whittmore lived in the town historically called Menotomy. It later was renamed to West Cambridge and then renamed again to Arlington. He did serve on the Cambridge Committee of Correspondence, but he didn't live there, at least not in any permanent way. Also, just a minor point, but through the video, Nick pronounces Concord like Concord.
To Lexington and Concord, British advanced towards Concord on the entire town of Concord, marching to Concord.
Which, while it's phonetically, that's how it's spelt, I can tell you as a New Englander that it is pronounced Concord like Concord. Anyways, let's get to the important stuff around the Revolution. Let's start with some mistakes Nick makes characterizing the British expedition to Concord.
I'm going to take 700 men, an entire regiment.
While the number of men, around 750, was as big as a regiment, the unit was actually made up of elite companies from a bunch of different regiments all mashed together. This is important since it meant that the British were in an unfamiliar and confusing command structure, which led to many mistakes along the way, which we'll touch on in a minute.
While they're in Lexington, they're going to arrest those stupid, annoying revolutionaries.
This is a common misconception, and it's actually half true. The official orders that Gage got from London were to capture revolutionary leaders. However, they gave Gage flexibility in how he decided to deal with the rebel movement. Gage knew that since the Revolutionary Intelligence Network was so good, there was no way he was going to be able to catch the leaders in hiding. Instead, Gage focused on destroying supplies in Concord, since heavy military supplies don't have legs for the most part. The British expedition had no intention of stopping in Lexington at all, and they weren't actively looking for revolutionary leaders who were there, like John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Although, to be fair, the colonists didn't actually know this at the time. Next, Nick talks about the ride of Paul Revere. This is another myth in American history that is oft repeated, so I don't blame Nick too much here. Paul Revere absolutely did exist, but he did not act alone on that night. The main spy ringleader in Boston was Dr. Joseph Warren. As Nick says, the people of Boston noticed the redcoats arraying to ship out, and they saw the ships drawn up in the harbor as well. The main way of communicating the incoming Brits was a set of lanterns in the steeple of the Old North Church. If one lantern was going to be hung, it meant the redcoats were coming south via land via the Boston Neck, and if there were two, it meant that they were going across the Boston Harbor to the north or to the west. As a backup, Warren sent William Dawes out of the town before the curfew that night. Paul Revere was actually the third string warning, and he rode north to Charlestown, where he then rode through the countryside to warn people. Still, he kind of gets all the credit for two main reasons. One is because Revere was a very well-connected man, and he knew exactly which houses and which people to warn, so he was far more efficient than Dawes or the lanterns,
telling everybody that the British are coming.
However, Revere almost certainly didn't say the British are coming, since everyone at the time would have considered themselves British. Instead, he likely said something like the regulars are coming, which just refers to soldiers. And the second reason we believe this myth all about Paul Revere is that it's made famous by the poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which was written 86 years later. Okay, now to the actual battle itself. This is what Nick had to say about the fight in Lexington.
The British are marching and they're almost to Lexington, and they are cut off by 77 Minutemen.
First things first, the Minutemen at Lexington were not cutting off the British. Captain John Parker intended to make a show of force against the British, but he did not ever plan on a fight breaking out. We can see a map of Lexington Green here. The road that the British were marching on is on the south of the green, while the Lexington militia were about 100 yards away on the north side of the green. Their whole job was just to stand there as a warning, not to fight or block the British. And as we said earlier, the British had no intention of stopping in Lexington at all.
The British roll up with 700 trained professional soldiers and tell these 77 Minutemen, literally farmers that just picked up whatever guns they had around.
Slight correction here as well. While the British column was around 750 strong total, only a vanguard of 200 men were present for the fighting in Lexington. Nick also sort of downplays the professionalism of the Lexington Minutemen here. While they certainly weren't full-time soldiers, the Lexington militia in particular was very well equipped and well disciplined. As an example, anyone who spoke out during roll call would actually be fined, and the militia actually trained regularly. It was larger than the men present on the green, about 130 men total, so a bit more than half were there for the actual fight, but many of the men had gone home or fallen asleep since they had been out for hours in the middle of the night.
Had around and told them, "Disperse, you rebel scum," at which point the Minutemen are like, "Nah, we're good. We're gonna stay right here, and so are you."
So this is another inaccuracy. While it is true that the British moved onto the green and ordered the militia to disarm and disperse, the American reaction was not as stalwart as Nick says. When ordered to disperse, Captain Parker actually ordered his men to obey that, but he didn't give them the order to lay down their arms. However, Parker actually had tuberculosis at the time, and with all the commotion and jeering, this was not like a silent scene, this was very loud. People couldn't really hear him. Still, at the time that the shot fully rang out, many of the militiamen were actually already dispersing as the Redcoats had told them to.
Suddenly, from the American side, a gun goes off. Nobody knows who fired, nobody knows why, but this was the shot heard around the world that would start the American Revolution.
So here's another common misconception. The shot at Lexington is not the shot heard around the world. The famous term also comes from a poem written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. However, the term shot heard around the world refers to the exchange of fire at Concord Bridge. This was the more significant event, since it was the first time that there were deliberate orders by Americans to fire on the British. As for who actually fired the first shot at Lexington, we don't know. It may have been from the American side, it may have been from the British side, and there's arguments for both. Also worth noting, this whole thing happens at like 5:30 in the morning. Everyone had already been up all night, so that kind of just makes mistakes way more likely to happen. Both forces were relatively well trained, but the Lexington militia was still, at the end of the day, a militia, making it possible a rogue could have fired a round. There's also theories that someone not in the militia but in the town actually fired at the British on their own, or that someone just out there in the town had fired their gun totally unrelated to the event.
And for all we know, it could have been some old farmer that just dropped his gun.
At the same time, the British had a very confusing command structure, and later at the fighting in Concord, the fighting there was actually started again by a lone redcoat firing off a shot by himself, so this was not unprecedented. Further, there is a theory that an American prisoner was actually shot behind the British lines while trying to escape. Even after they told him he could leave, it was kind of confusing, and that this may have actually been the fateful shot. So on this point, Nick could be right, but it's all unknown, so you can't really affirmatively say it was American or English. The battle itself is honestly more of a massacre. Once the shot went off, the British opened fire, even though the British officers kept kind of trying to rein them in at first. Only a few Americans returned fire, and most just ran away since they were already ordered to stand down and were horribly outnumbered. After an unknown number of volleys, the British charged and then bayoneted a few men. When all this was said and done, 8 Americans were killed and 9 were wounded. Of those 8 killed, only 2 of them were killed on the actual battle line, so most were fleeing when they were killed. The Americans only managed to graze 2 redcoats and a horse, so they weren't able to kill any British or even seriously wound any.
The surviving Minutemen take off to go tell everybody that the Revolutionary War has officially begun.
This is sort of a nitpick, but I think it's just a general thing to keep in mind when talking about history. At the time of Lexington, no one fully understood its significance. No one knew that a war had begun necessarily, although, that feeling was kind of in the air. Most of those that were fighting weren't actually interested in independence, even if there was a war. Instead, it was the fighting at Concord that was more decisive in the minds of the Americans at the time. But generally speaking, it's often the case that people in a given time don't realize how important an event is when it happens, and they don't think of the same way as we do today. As an example, Romans didn't think that the sacking of Rome in 476 was actually the fall of the Roman Empire, even if that's the date that we point to today. But to give Nick credit, the battle absolutely was seen as a big deal at the time. They just didn't realize that until Concord, and even then they didn't comprehend what the war could result in.
They run across a bridge and start ripping the planks off of it as they go, at which point the 2,000 Minutemen and 700 British soldiers fire upon one another from either side of this bridge as the British continue to retreat.
This part is pretty much just wrong the whole way. Barrett's men at Concord Bridge numbered between 400 to 550 men, a total of 10 companies, not 2,000 men. The British assumed the number was upwards of 1,500, they were wrong obviously, and the total number of militia in the general area may have been closer to 2,000, but they were not present at the bridge and they were not involved in any fighting at this point. There were also not the full 700 Brits at the bridge, because they were scattered throughout the town and surrounding area, and there were only around 100 British actually at the bridge when the battle started. There is some truth to pulling up the planks from the bridge. There were conflicting orders on the British side. Remember, they had really bad command structure at the time. One officer started to do this and pull planks off, but how far he got before the Americans accosted him is unknown, and it's likely that no planks were actually taken off. Either way, it had no effect. Nick doesn't go into detail about the fighting here, but it's actually a lot more exciting and more important than the fighting at Lexington. As we said earlier, the British opened fire first, likely with warning shots into the river and then an actual volley, which killed 2 Americans, including an officer, and wounded 3 more. The Americans, ordered by Major John Buttrick, returned fire, killing 2 Brits in turn and wounding 8, nearly half of the British officers at the bridge. The larger number that Nick states here is accurate, but this happens later in the day and only 4 people died here. For about 2 hours, no one actually really knew what to do, and the British didn't retreat at first. They just hung around for a few hours and they were planning on leaving anyway. There were actually some interesting moments. For example, a lot of the militia just kind of milled around or went home after the fight. They didn't really know what to do. A group of British soldiers had actually crossed the bridge earlier, and then they crossed back and just like walked right past the Americans, and they just, didn't do anything. There was a tense standoff later in the day, but it was actually broken when a mentally ill man went between the lines and was trying to sell his hard cider to people. Now we get to Whittmore himself. The story that Nick tells here is pretty accurate. The one nitpick I'll have here is that it's believed that Whittmore actually was taking pot shots at the Brits further away. It wasn't just that close range. And the famous fight happens when some grenadiers were approaching his position as a result of those pot shots. Go to Nick's video for the full awesome story, but here I'll just give some general info about the fighting in this part of the battle. The British column was being attacked once they got about a mile outside of Concord, and the attacks persisted from there. The British were almost routed before they got to Lexington, as the militia numbers had reached around 4,000 men strong. However, a relief column made it to Lexington with cannons and scared the Americans off for a little bit. Whittmore wasn't the only old man who played a large role in the battle, interestingly. There were other old men. They were called exempts for exempt from fighting, and they weren't required to fight, but they fought anyway, including Whittmore. This relief column had an ammo carriage following behind them, since the cannons didn't have many rounds for the British. But in Monotony, a group of these exempts intercepted the ammo carriage, ensuring the Brits couldn't put up a long fight. Had the rest of the militia around Lexington known that, they may have been able to brave the few cannon shots and just totally destroy the British force. The unified British force, now retreating to Boston around 1,800 strong, continued back to the city, where the worst was actually yet to come. The worst fighting of the battle was in the town of Monotony, where Whittmore lived. The town saw heavy building-to-building fighting, as well as many civilian deaths and even war crimes by the British. In the fighting, 25 Americans were killed along with 40 British between Monotony and Cambridge. This was more than half of the deaths for the whole battle, which is kind of interesting because it's called the Battle of Lexington and Concord, even though way more people died in Monotony and Cambridge. And if you go watch Nick's video, you'll know the part that Samuel Whittmore played in this bloody and pivotal point in American history. So that's it for this video, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Again, go check out the Fat Electrician's video for the wider story on Samuel Whittmore. It's a great video overall. I just wanted to correct a few mistakes because I've been like nerding out on this one part of history for the last few months. Easy video. I am way behind on my video creation schedule, as you may have been able to tell. But I should be coming into more time for that soon, and I am working on a big video on the Battle of Lexington and Concord, working on the next 15 decisive battles video as well. Going to be doing something like a super deep dive into like the entire Assassin's Creed lore and the wider history around it. So just lots of stuff coming. It's just slow, big projects that are taking me forever to do. But thank you so much for watching. If you're still here, thank you. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, all that fun stuff. And I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.